the single most risky thing I ever did in my life, apart from marrying Jeffrey probably, was to say to myself, I'm going to quit and I'm going to do something a bit different. And so I did.
If I'm awake, I'm working. And one day my wife said to me, Mike, that isn't something to be proud of. You know, you should relax a little bit and spend time with the kids and that. I was a Brexit candidate, which just blew me away how much hate I gathered just for having a political opinion. Very much misguided in the attacking.
The early climate change models tended to be a bit apocalyptic.
Welcome back to another episode of Success is a System. We're here today with Dame Mary Archer, who has very kindly invited us into her beautiful home. And I was just looking yesterday and realised that Dame Mary has been married 57 years, and we found out today is the anniversary. So congratulations, and thank you for letting us come into your home.
Thank you, Mike. It's good to have you.
And as you know, if you've watched Success is a System before, we talk to individuals about their background, about things they've achieved, about challenges, overcoming those challenges, and the systems that have made them successful in their chosen areas. So we hope to just have a chat, but along the way find out about that. But as I was looking through, and obviously we met in connection with Cambridge Children's Hospital, which I would love to take some time to talk about. You're the patron, I'm an ambassador. I'm very proud to be an ambassador and pleased to be connected. But in looking at some of your accolades, Dame Mary, I had to write them down because there are literally so many. So I didn't realise that Dame Mary was a scientist in the area of solar power and literally groundbreaking in that technology at its early stages, and still very passionate about renewables and getting to net zero. So we'll talk a bit about that. Dame Mary has been a non-exec of Anglia TV, chair of Cambridge University Hospital's NHS Foundation, vice chair at Adam Brooks 2005 to 2008, deputy chair of Adam Brooks Charitable Trust 1997 to 2015, chair of the Science Museum Group, chancellor of the University of Buckinghamshire, Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire. And we could go on, Dame Mary. It's such a wonderful list of achievements. And often we hide our own light under a bushel. And for some people, it's quite embarrassing to get all of these recognitions. How do you deal with that kind of limelight or recognition when I read out a long list like that?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not actually very fond of talking about myself, so I hope this podcast is not going to seem too difficult for anybody who happens to listen. But I guess I feel, although I haven't messed about, I could have done more.
Right.
And there's always something more. I guess that's my view.
Yeah, and I think similarly, I meet lots of entrepreneurs, and they feel guilty almost when they're not busy or when they're not working. And so the biggest challenge, I think, for a lot of successful people is relaxing.
I absolutely identify with that. I've always been a workaholic. I think I was about 15 when I was told for the first time, you know, if you work that hard, you're going to burn yourself out.
Yeah.
And I haven't yet. But I do have great trouble relaxing. My only real hobby is singing. So nice. I sing in a little group in Cambridge, which is great because it's like gardening. Actually, it sort of fills your mind with something other than work and worries.
I'm a bit tone deaf myself, but so you'll be glad to know I'm not going to be singing today. But I can resonate with that work ethic as well, and partly through growing up. And I used to say with pride, I once retired in 2012. I didn't say that with pride, but and then I got bored very quickly. And I used to say prior to that if I'm awake, I'm working. And one day my wife said to me, Mike, that isn't something to be proud of. You know, you should relax a little bit and spend time with the kids and that. And that was part of what led to my stopping, because I was all over the world and realised that actually what was most dear to me and most important to me was at home, and I was often not at home. But I can see from the things you do and the conversation we had at the event for Cambridge Children's Hospital that it seems that all of the, or from what I've read, all of the things that you've got accolades in are things that are very dear to your heart, for which you hold a close passion. So I guess it feels less like work if that's the case.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I'm very fortunate that I've always been able to do something I really wanted to do, and have had a fair amount of freedom latterly. When you rise to a senior position in an organisation, it comes with great responsibility because you've got a lot of influence, if not direct power, if you're a non-executive chairman. But you have to deploy that very carefully. And in my case, not overstep the boundary between the non-executive and the executive. But in terms of work-life balance, I mean, I've always been very bad at that. And my two boys, now in their late 40s, early 50s, I'm afraid would testify to that because I was a working mum. But I think it's the 5 grandchildren that have now made me slightly haul back, because I realise how quickly they grow up.
Yes, no, absolutely. And they do say that we are almost better parents to our grandchildren than our own children, because when we've got our own children, often we're busy trying to put food on the table or to just achieve, to give them security that they need. And also we've not got the level of maturity that we enjoy as we get a bit older.
As we get a bit older, yes.
Yeah, so I look forward to that at some point. My daughters are 21 and 24, I look forward to grandchildren, although not in too much of a rush. But, so let's talk about some of those things that you have had a passion for, do have a passion for. And one of the things that surprised me is, I think it said your solar power interest. When did that start? Because I didn't even realise solar power was around until about the last, say, 20, 25 years, but it's been around much longer.
It has, though. In this country, in the UK, it was regarded as a really long shot back then. So what happened was, I was working in Oxford, and Geoffrey and I wanted to start a family. So I decided I wanted to get a job in London. And I went to the Royal Institution in Albemarle Street in London, which has a scientific laboratory, which was then directed by a wonderful chap called Sir George Porter, later Lord Porter, Nobel laureate, in 1967. And he was working on a technique called flash photolysis, which involves light and the effect of light on materials. And I had been working in electrochemistry, so batteries and fuel cells and corrosion prevention and all that. And so when I went to see George and said I wanted to come to work for you, he said, well, you can't really, you know, we do photochemistry and you're an electrochemist. And I said, I'm sure there's a link between the two. And she said, well, go and find one. And I did. In the old literature, there was some American declassified military stuff about attempts by the American scientific military to build a battery that could be recharged in sunlight. Not very successful, I have to say. But anyway, I went back to George in great triumph and said, here, there's this interdisciplinary field and let's work on it. So he said, okay, and hired me. And then I got really lucky, because that was 1972, and in 1973-ish came the first oil price hike by OPEC. Right. And suddenly the world woke up to energy security, or the lack of it nationally, and the fact that oil and gas, there wasn't concern about climate change, but the concern about the cost and the kind of embargoes that OPEC at that time, the cartel power it had. And so suddenly there was a lot of international interest in renewables and converting solar energy to electric power or fuels. Splitting water to make hydrogen was the primary one. And so that suddenly meant our little backwater became quite hot. Right, and that's what turned me on to solar power and then later renewables more generally.
But so 1972, 73, literally we're 50 years on.
Yes.
And I mean, clearly the world has moved on a little bit, but it's, when you look at it in that context, it's a bit sad that we're still so far away from net zero or looking after the planet. Have we made good progress, or has it been slow, do you think? What's your position on renewables and net zero? And
Well, way back then, climate change was really not an issue. It was much more about energy security and the cost of energy. And indeed, back in the 60s, there was a Club of Rome anxiety about simply running out of fossil fuels,
yes,
running out of oil. And then what will we
I was
do?
at school and they said we'd run out in the 80s.
Yes, exactly. Well, yes, exactly. Like we are meant to have run out of a whole lot of things that actually we haven't, because we tend to find new reserves or resources. So climate change started to become an issue in scientific circles in the late 80s, early 90s. But it didn't really catch on politically until, I would say, the noughties.
Right.
So the legally binding Climate Change Act, which the UK has passed to say we should be net zero as a country, as a country by 2050. I think that was 2008, and the COP, the Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Climate Change Committee. We've got to COP27, so that's been going for 27 years. So maybe I'm saying, yeah, round about the 90s, late 90s, climate change started to become an issue. But I think one of the difficulties with really acting on it at that time was, first of all, the scientists couldn't say with certainty that the increase in temperature was due to carbon dioxide. That took a little longer to establish. And then I guess the other thing was that the early climate change models tended to be a bit apocalyptic.
Yeah.
And there was quite a backlash.
The fear, maybe.
Oversold the fear, and there was a bit of a backlash against that.
Interestingly, I spent about 15 years of my career in oil companies on the retail side, but obviously as a senior manager, you get involved in all of that. And for me, I was never sure about the climate change per se, but if people ask me today, I would say, well, I'm not kind of anti fuel, but I do know that the fumes are carcinogenic. I do know that when I travel the world and go to cities that have got lots of petrol-fueled vehicles or diesel-fueled vehicles, there's a smog that I wouldn't want my children to grow up around. So I think the closer we can bring it to people's home or lives, the more they can't deny it, because the developed world, and we can understand all the reasons of greed, I guess, seem to want to be pushing a denier attitude as much as they do the importance of renewables, and that's getting in the way, I think, of doing the right thing for future generations, for health, as much as anything else. I think.
Well, I agree with that. There are health issues absolutely in big cities.
Yeah. So moving on to the list of involvement you've got with hospitals, where did that come from? From solar and scientist to all of the involvement with University Hospital, Adam Brooks, and we'll talk in a bit about the Children's Hospital as well.
Well, after my time at the Royal Institution with George Porter, I got a fellowship to teach at Cambridge, and that's what brought us with our young family to Cambridge. And I stayed teaching for 10 years. And then after 10 years, or coming up to 10 years, I thought, well, that's the longest time I've ever been in one job.
Right.
Am I going to do another decade, or am I going to do something different? And probably the single most risky thing I ever did in my life, apart from marrying Geoffrey probably, was to say to myself, I'm going to quit, and I'm going to do something a bit different. And so I did. I resigned after 10 years and took up a bit of a portfolio career. But one of the things was I was invited to join the board of Adam Brooks NHS Trust, the trust that ran the hospital.
Yeah.
And that gave me a big new interest in life. And I became vice chairman and then eventually chairman for 10 years of what had by then become Cambridge University Hospital's NHS Foundation Trust.
Yeah.
So Addenbrooke's and the Rosie to the locals.
And then more recently, Papworth has moved in.
And Papworth has moved in, though it's a separate trust. But yes, no, the Cambridge Biomedical Campus has really grown and flowered wonderfully. And it's a huge resource, not only for Cambridge and the east of England, but for the country and indeed for the world.
And then the next evolution of Cambridge hospitals being the Cambridge Children's Hospitals,
Yes.
which I was very moved by when Helen approached me. And I just loved the simplicity of, one whole child, whole life, whole family, whole world. Would you want to expand a little bit on that? Because being the patron,
Yes.
I know it's a massive passion for you.
It is indeed. So throughout my time as chair of Cambridge University Hospitals, we always knew we needed a children's hospital on the campus. There are children's services. There are 4 children's wards in Addenbrooke's Hospital, but they're all hugger-mugger with the adult wards. There's only one children's outpatient dedicated to children outpatient clinic, and otherwise children have to go to adult outpatient clinics. There are no operating theatres dedicated to children. So children have really not had the place and the space that they need. And the east of England is in fact the only region of the country that does not have a children's hospital. So, as I say, throughout my time as chair, I always wanted to build one, but it's not cheap. And we could never amass the capital from the NHS at that stage. But we did manage to build a wonderful new wing on the front of the Rosie, the maternity hospital. And we also built a treatment centre. So we did do some capital development. But anyway, Children's Hospital eluded us. So fast forward, I stood down from chairing Addenbrooke CUH in 2012. 3 or 4 years later, NHS was beginning to recover a bit, and there was some capital available. And so I was part of a little consortium that got together and said, come on, let's go for the Children's Hospital again. And we bid under a programme and got £100 million.
Fantastic.
So that really kick-started, it turned the Children's Hospital from an aspiration and a dream into a plan.
Challenge being we've got to match that 100
yes,
million.
we got to match that 100 million. So I co-chair the campaign to find the philanthropic 100
but we're
million.
somewhat 40 million in now?
47.7 now.
Fantastic. I mean, and I can relate to it so much what you say about being the only county without that facility. I'm from Peterborough. My 5 generations of my family are from Peterborough. My younger sister had a child that was born with issues and had to have regular blood transfusions and so on. And so often she would have to go into Great Ormond Street. And whilst it was a great hospital, she was always having to find someone to look after her other children, which was a stress for her. She couldn't afford the cost of that or the cost of the trains. But equally, the children had to go through mummy's off again. And there's all the dynamics that people don't think. They think about their ill child, and rightly so. But some of the psychological impacts on the parents and on the siblings who aren't perhaps getting all the attention they feel they deserve and probably do deserve. And so what I particularly liked about the Cambridge Children's Hospital was the whole child, because, and I'm sure you'll correct me because you're far more educated on the hospital side than me, but at 18, if you've been brought up by Children's Services, you have to, in effect, you're pushed away and you have to just go into standard NHS. So even though you spent 18 years feeling like these people are part of your family, you built confidence, you built trust, suddenly you're kind of out there on your own. So that whole child saying that if we're looking after you, we will continue to look after you. That whole family saying family can go to the new Children's Hospital and there are kitchens where you can bake cakes together. There are gardens where you could plant some flowers together. And mum or dad, you will have your own room. So mum or dad will always be able to sleep with you and you will not be on your own in an adult ward. And so that's the whole family. So the whole child, it's sorry, I missed the whole child. It's the psychology and the physical.
Yes.
And then the last bit being the whole world. There are people who are absolutely exceptional all over the world, but historically we had to rely on, and we're grateful for, I guess, the skill sets that were in the hospital we happen to be at. Now, with modern robotic surgery and access to consultants who have specialisms and skills all around the world, by the likes of Zoom and Teams for consultation and robotic surgery, the hospital will be able to access the best in the world all over the world. Is that?
And contribute to it too, yes, because embedded in the Children's Hospital, which would be a beautiful hospital, beautiful green design in the sense of terrace gardens, and green space is so important for children, and green in the sense of low carbon emissions. Children will have a much more healing environment, and single rooms, as you say, will allow parents to stay. We'll have a proper school where children who are well enough, as it were, can go and sit in class, so they don't lose that social interaction or skill. But importantly, the point you made, the whole child. So as you'll know, historically and today, the NHS treats physical problems and mental problems largely separate in secondary care. So the acute physical hospital is just that. That's Addenbrooke's for us. And mental health acute services for adults and children are run by a separate trust. And in the case of Cambridgeshire, the headquarters for the Cambridge area are at Fulbourn, 3 miles to the east of Cambridge. And so they're geographically and organisationally, they're quite separate. And that doesn't make a lot of sense at any age, but it makes no sense at all for children and young people who, if they're sadly unwell enough mentally to need inpatient care, they tend to have physical problems as well. They may have an eating disorder. They may sadly self-harm themselves for various reasons. And so they are physically unwell, sometimes very unwell. Likewise, the children who are sick enough to be inpatients in Addenbrooke's for a long time, by which I mean weeks or months, will usually have cancer, a childhood cancer. So maybe having a course of chemotherapy, or maybe recovering from surgery, or have radiotherapy. And so they can become anxious and depressed. I mean, children are resilient, but they pick these things up from their parents, who are obviously very worried about them. And so the Children's Hospital, Cambridge Children's Hospital, will be the first in the world fully to integrate the mental and physical health care of children. So the staff will be dual trained. That's not to say there won't be specialists, but they will be dual trained, as it were, to cope with the whole child in front of them. And not to say I'll just have to go and get sister down the corridor to deal with that.
No, or you've got to go in a taxi too, an ambulance too.
No.
But I find it's wonderful that it's a first in the world, but it's also shocking that that doesn't already exist. And I guess great to see that leading the charge and hopefully leading to change in other hospitals. You mentioned about children cancer, and I may not looking now, but I ran a few marathons in my time, and one of them was for a charity called KidScan, and it was for children's cancer research specifically, because often they're given the same treatments as adults, but it ravages their little bodies and it's just too much. So even getting down to the level of saying they need a different type of treatment, a different type of care that has to recognize their tiny little bodies and the weakness that such an awful disease can have on them. So
yes, you're absolutely right. And paediatricians like to say that children are not small adults. And for example, the types of cancer they get are different. Yes. And when they get ill, they can get very ill very quickly. But likewise, they can bounce back very quickly.
Hope you're enjoying Success is a System. Every Tuesday we launch it on all podcast platforms and on YouTube. Drop us a note and tell us who you would like to see or hear on Success is a System, or what subjects you'd like us to cover to help you and your business. Success is a System. Like, subscribe, and make sure you get it every Tuesday for great lessons and systems that have made people wealthy, healthy and successful.
So embedded in the Cambridge Children's Hospital will be a University of Cambridge staffed research institute aimed at looking at the big problems that confront children around the world. So I'll probably not name all 6 perfectly, but diabetes and obesity, childhood cancer, neonatal issues, infection and inflammation, mental health and neurodegenerative diseases, and precision medicine. That's very important. So that's genomic medicine.
Right.
So that's something, of course, that's relatively new, but now whole genomes can be scanned, can be read, and then deciphered using data crunching and AI now. And patterns can be recognized. So genetic influences and causes of problems in childhood can be identified. There's a whole bunch of what are called rare diseases that children can suffer from. Individually, they're quite rare, but actually there's 10,000 of them plus. So wow. In terms of an inpatient population for a pediatric hospital, they're not that uncommon. And they're all genomically based. Often they lead to a metabolic disorder, so the child may be too thin or too fat. And these now increasingly can be diagnosed, and increasingly now you know where the genetic mistakes are. You've got a drug that will target that mistake. And maybe even the genetic mistake can be put right using this technique called CRISPR, which slices out a faulty gene or part of a gene and puts in the right bit.
It's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's... You think about the hospital, and until you were just talking then, I hadn't fully appreciated the importance of the research and university element of it for not just treating an issue today, but being able to start to understand, predict and cure things going forward. And that, of course, that knowledge can then become a global benefit.
Absolutely. That's the whole idea. Everything is, as it were, open source. But the idea is, if you can diagnose such a thing early enough before it becomes a big clinical problem and the child is physically and obviously very unwell, you have a chance of arresting it, perhaps even curing it, and altering that child's whole life course.
That's incredible. And sadly, my nephew that I talked about is no longer with us. But, knowing this is there for future generations is inspiring to me. And I don't normally do this on a podcast, but I'm going to say, if you've ever had any desire to work with a charity, to support a charity, to raise funds for a charity, to donate to a charity that will change future generations and have a global impact, make contact, because it is quite wonderful. And we've already got the land, we've got the planning, we're ready. Are we broken ground, or we're ready to break ground?
No, got to do that by next March.
Okay, so we're ready to break ground, and this is happening now, and it's wonderful. And I've got to say, I drove down to the site a few months ago, and I noticed there was a road there, Dame Mary Archer Way.
Which, I know.
and I mentioned it to you when we met at the recent event, and I said, it must be wonderful to have a road named after you. And you did make me chuckle, because you said, yes, I want an airport next. And that was like, I know it was in
just
jest.
A joke.
I know it was a joke, but it is wonderful to see that there's still lots of ambition and things you want to do. And when we were with Charlie, who's nearly 71 last week, and Charlie, he said, oh yeah, next year I'm going again. I'm going to build it bigger and better. And that ambition is very contagious and very inspiring, and it's great to see, because I see so many young people who are maybe in their 20s, and they kind of feel like they're giving up already.
Yeah.
How do we how do we inspire young people? You know, is it something you I mean, obviously you're connected to education through the hospitals, and you were a teacher. Does education concern you, or how some of the things that are going on today?
Well, not really. I would say that, I was a bookish child and I did well at all my exams and, got into university and all the rest of it. But I can see that that's made me something of a conformist. And, the people who leave school at 14 and start a plumber's business, they're the enterprising mold breakers. So I tend to work within systems, so within a hospital or within a museum. But I think it must be awful not to know what you want to do with your life, or not to know why you're getting out of bed.
Well, and it's interesting you talked about working within the system and so on, because in addition to Charlie, who's a great example of that, Neville Wright, who was the founder of Kiddie Care, who sold was the biggest sale ever for one shop at £70 million, and has since gone on and built massive industrial estates, commercial job creation centres, if you like. But he too left school at 15, and when we were doing the podcast, he said, I was gifted with ADHD. And I said, I've never heard it described like that before. Well, he said, well, if I didn't have ADHD, I'd have probably done better at school. If I'd have done better at school, I'd have probably gone to university. If I'd have gone to university, I'd have probably got a good job, and it would have been hard to give up a good job. But I had nothing to lose. And it is interesting to look at that. And, interestingly, one of the things that I think about education, and I am passionate about it. I was so honoured to be awarded an honorary doctorate of education, and I have spoken at all the schools within a large radius of where I am, good, bad, and indifferent. And I know the importance to me of education during school and certainly thereafter. But one of the things I've been thinking about lately and talking to more people about is that if you look at medicine, it's been revolutionary over the last 200 years, what has been achieved. If you look at communication, it's been revolutionary in the last couple of 100 years, and certainly decades as we've gone to mobile phones and AI and different things like that. If you look at architecture, you could say positively or negatively, but it is revolutionized how we can build and where we can build, even cities on water nowadays and so on. But I can't help getting away from this picture of schools where 200 years ago, you would have sat in a class of 10, 20, 30, watching a teacher having to necessarily, because there's 30, 20, having to necessarily teach in a one-dimensional way, whether or not that suits your learning style. And yet today, 200 years later, we pretty much still sit in front of a teacher, and it hasn't evolved. Is it due to a revolution, or what's your thoughts on the state? And it's not a criticism even of schools or education. For me, it's just is it time that sector had a revolution?
I think probably that sitting in class with a teacher in front of you is also about learning social skills and sort of fitting in and success and failure. So I think there's quite a lot going for it. But education at school level is certainly changing. My eldest grandchild, now 10, is doing quite a lot of his homework online through a program, I think it's called Atom, which I found really interesting because I work a bit with him and see how it's going. And the thought processes that it encourages are really rather different from the thought processes I was taught by, if you see what I mean.
So it has evolved.
Yes, it has evolved in a kind of fairly gentle way. And certainly adult learning has changed. Bite-sized learning is all the thing now, and that's how I think we do tend to learn best.
And there is nothing you can't learn on the internet to some degree, is
Absolutely
there? Other
not.
than the social skills, probably.
Yes, other than the social skills, and perhaps maybe they slightly have a negative effect on those.
Yeah, I mean, it reminded me, as you were saying, I was once on holiday in Florida, and we were at a hotel complex, and there was a family that had 12 children, and I was chatting to them, and they were a Catholic family, and I was saying, gosh, I've got 2, and that seems hard enough. How do you cope with 12? And they said, we're blessed with it and so on. But they said, what you get with a big family is often the older siblings do part of the parenting and teaching of the younger siblings.
Yes.
And anyway, they went on to say that they homeschooled all of their children.
Good grief.
And they were both, one was a teacher, one was a vet. And I thought, how on earth do you do that? And they went on to tell me how many millions of people are homeschooling in America. And I said, but don't you need to be a trained teacher or qualified in subjects to do that? And they were very much of we've got encyclopedias, we've got the internet and so on. And they said the best way to learn is to teach. And so a lot of the embedding of the learning for the children as they get older is teaching the younger ones what they need to know. And so I then said, well, the only problem I see with that, because I can see they're very intelligent children and very just beautiful, wonderful behavior children as well. And I said, but what about the socialization? And they made a point that I couldn't easily argue with. They said, well, actually, that happens through our church. We do this on at least one day in the week, and we do it at the weekend. And the difference is we know the moral and ethical boundaries that they're being socialized within, and they are spending time with people of a similar moral, similar ethics. And it did concern me that sometimes, certainly the school I went to, the socialization could have been as negative. In fact, it was for many people as it was positive, because we are the average of the 5 people we spend most time with, the importance of association. Yeah, I mean, I'm really torn at this moment about, I'm not in favour of homeschooling for the reasons you say, but finding the blend that can be individual to each child and their needs, especially if they're on the spectrum anywhere, and involve the parents somewhat, because I think a lot of parents are saying, you teach them, it's your job, and not getting involved. Great to hear that you said you're involved with your grandchild. So I think it's one for me that I'll continue to be passionate about, but I can't help thinking we need to explore, at the rate that medicine is evolving, different ways of being more effective at connecting with and motivating and inspiring young people and young adults, I think.
Well, you're absolutely right. Of course, people, as it were, imitate or learn from or somehow fall in with the people they're around. So, for better or for worse, you are partly moulded by the 5 people who are closest to you. That puts a lot of responsibility on parents, doesn't it? And the Princess of Wales Early Years Foundation, I think, is right on the money in thinking how important it is that those very early years, with mum in particular, but dad too, one hopes, form strong and stable relationships on which the child can build. But going back to learning from older ones, this family of 12, that's quite something. So I'm the middle of 3 children, but we're quite widely spaced. And my sister is 5.5 years older than I am, and my brother 5 years younger than I am. And I always attribute the success I've had in life, insofar as I've had success, to my sister, who taught me my letters and numbers when I was quite a toddler.
Yeah. No, and I mean, we know that children learn at a tremendous pace when they're young. It does make me wonder if I was going to say if there should be some schooling at an earlier age, but there are nurseries there that get them onto that. But siblings are a perfect example, and parents to do that. I was once a governor at a school, and we would get letters sometimes. It was a particularly challenging school, but we would get letters sometimes that would say, could you tell them they've got to go to bed at 7 o'clock because they won't listen to us, and things like that. And you think, you're the parent. What do we do? But I mean, interested to talk about the early years, because one of the first things I learned doing various training around behavioural profiling, which I do and I'm passionate about, was the saying, and it sounds sexist, but of course it's talking about both genders, primary genders. We have too many genders these days, but is that show me a boy of 7 and I'll show you a man, and it's talking about the fact that a lot of those behaviours, that confidence, that passions, are pretty much embedded by the age of 7, and you can see that in children at a very early age, whether they're more creative or sporty or driven and so on. So I think that early years thing is, I shall look further into that myself, actually. So we haven't talked about politics.
No, we haven't.
We haven't talked about politics, and I've never seen you as someone who's very political, and but you've obviously been engulfed in that environment somewhat because of with Jeffrey, I should say, rather than because of Jeffrey. And I was interested to read yesterday. I was a Brexit candidate, which just blew me away how much hate I gathered just for having a political opinion. Very much misguided in the attacking. I'm not racist. I've never been prejudiced. Quite the opposite. I thought it was an opportunity to not be part of a club, but to be part of a world. And recognizing the need that we need other people to come into this country, but we also need them to bring something, was my view. But I read, where I'm getting to, sorry, a long-winded way, is that you were a leaver and Jeffrey was a remainer.
Yes.
And at the time, I remember reading how families were really split on this. And I don't think it's a bad thing, because I do believe conflict leads to clarity, or debate is a good thing because we can either both learn, or we might just be more certain of our original opinion because of it. But was that an awkward time during that Brexit campaign?
No. Jeffrey and I agreed to differ. He was always going to be a Remainer because when he was a young MP and in the period before that, when he was on the GLC of blessed memory, the Greater London Council is no more, he was very pro-European, and he worked for Edward Heath in an indirect way in terms of UK membership of the European Union. So, but I think what he liked, and I liked it too at that stage, was the common market. Goods and trade, freedom of goods and services and so forth. That makes a lot of sense. But when it came to the campaign, I was concerned about the loss of sovereignty, and I didn't like the direction that the European Union was going in, and still is actually, about a common defence policy and so forth, and also the damage that the euro was doing. And it was a good thing we never did join the euro. So it wasn't kind of a slam dunk position for me.
No, and across the country it was just over 50-50. I was always conscious as a confident and confident in my position leaver. I was always really comfortable, but I was also conscious that half the country really didn't want it and really hated it. So it was always going to be something that needed to be carefully executed. But I guess you mentioned the EEC, and I remember doing A-level geography at the time, and we were going into the European Economic Community. And to me, I could understand the logic of like a buying group, that if we were bigger, we could leverage our combined purchasing power and strength therein. But what I then saw, and it was what formed my opinion, was that it morphed into going beyond that, into laws and into military and into education and lots of areas that it never intended to, was sold as, and that was kind of my biggest challenge, because I saw, and people will hate me for this, I'm sure, but vive la différence. Is that I could see a united Europe, and the united element is positive. The negative is we become this kind of vanilla European, as opposed to the beauty of Italians being Italian and the French being the French, and the British being the British, and the English and the Scottish and the Welsh, and keeping that not just sovereignty but individual cultural heritage without it somewhat potentially being lost in a union that had gone beyond economic.
Well, that's an interesting point that I hadn't thought about, the extent to which cultural heritage would be kind of ironed out, and that's certainly a possibility. But I think you also see cultural heritage in this country being challenged in the name of eradicating inequality, and I think that's confusing two completely different issues.
Right. Yeah, well, it is confusing. It's got a complex subject, isn't it? And I think the challenge for me is so many people voted as they do in politics, I think a lot that, the joke is, but it's not funny, that if you painted a pig red or you painted a pig blue, some people would vote for the blue pig and some people would vote for the red pig. They don't really understand the policies or the implications of those policies. And it's not that they don't just understand because they can't understand. They're not interested to get into that level of understanding. It is just, my people are this side, my people are that side. And so I'm going to have a strong view, but it's not a view founded on any educated or informed or arguable position all too often.
Yeah, that may well be the case. I guess that the politicians I see, know exactly why they're in it. And it's often been said, democracy is a bad system, but it's just less bad than all the others. And so our rather adversarial parliamentary politics isn't a lot of fun to watch, I don't think, and certainly not a lot of fun to be in, though some love it, I have to say. But it seems to be a better system when you look at more totalitarian
as you travel
regimes.
around the world,
yes.
absolutely.
So,
absolutely. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. But
no, nor would I.
Yeah.
I love this country.
So moving off to politics, I'm conscious of time, and there was one more subject I wanted to get into. I know it's very dear to your heart, the Flying Scotsman.
Yes.
100-year anniversary this year.
Yes.
UK railways, UK trains. We took that to different parts of the world as well, and I think we're groundbreaking in that technology and so on. And you're very close to that and the National Rail Museum. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm chair of the Science Museum Group. The flagship is the Science Museum in South Kensington. It's the oldest museum in the group. But we also have the wonderful National Railway Museum in York and another smaller railway museum called Locomotion in Shildon, County Durham, one of the world's earliest railway towns, and two other museums, one in Manchester and one in Bradford. So yes, Flying Scotsman, which is the National Railway Museum's most famous locomotive, probably the world's most famous locomotive, is 100 years old this year. And so has been steaming up and down partly the main line and partly heritage railways, and drawing crowds as she always has. So you're absolutely right. Britain actually gave railways to the world, and 2025 will be the bicentenary of the birth of the railways, which is to say the inauguration of the first passenger ticketed railway line, which was the Stockton-Darlington line, which started off in September 1825. Wow. So there'll be a big celebration in 2025 of the bicentenary of the railways, which we did export. The Indian railways, other railways followed on from
which transformed logistics in some of these countries.
Transformed everything. So the Great Exhibition of 1851, which was held just up the road from where the Science Museum is, up the end of Exhibition Road in London, called Exhibition Road because the Great Exhibition of 1851 was in Crystal Palace in Hyde Park. A third of the country came to see that, and they could only do that because of the railways.
Yeah. I didn't realise it was of that scale.
Yeah.
That must have been something.
Yeah. It made a lot of money. And that's how really the museums got started. The money, Prince Albert was really one of the guiding spirits behind the 1851 exhibition, and he was very determined that there would be a cultural legacy. So the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum, all really came out of that.
And I guess sort of building on some of that national pride, I more so lately, I have always been proud of Great Britain, and I think it is a great country to be proud of. But I'm impressed when I see anyone's national passion, if you like, and the passion they have for heritage. And one of the things I was conscious of is that, and it's not going back to Brexit, but it was an area, is that we do need. And we've always been a very welcoming country, in my view. And when I built businesses around the world, I realised there's a lot more prejudice in different parts of the world that I experienced. And, one of the things I believe in that we should open our doors to people who can bring something or want to come and work towards being part of the growth of our great country. But all too often we hear how terrible we are. And yet I was just reading or hearing last week on the news that we still had net migration of 600,000 people. That suggests to me that it's not such a bad country if 600,000 people still want to come and be part of it and set up home and bring up families here. And so what makes Britain great from your perspective, Mary?
Well, we are a great nation, and I think we have a history that, on the whole, we can be proud of. And we have the rule of law. We have a tolerant society, I would say. You said you encountered more prejudice in other parts of the world, and I would agree with that. There are some pretty intolerant countries around. But of course, the phenomenon of immigration, not just into this country, but really into Europe, as the global South, as it were, starts to realize that life is better for some in the global North. That is something that is a real and ongoing issue and has to be addressed. I agree with you that those who can contribute to society and enter legally are welcome, but illegal immigration it's a real social issue.
Yeah, well, it's my mum, God bless her, she's not with me anymore, but she used to say it's not about prejudice, son. It's about the fact that she was always taken in if me or my sister or brother, we were in quite a rough area, had a friend who had been kicked out by their mum and dad, my mum would bring them in, and it'd be extended family for a period, and the house always had strangers that become family in and around it. She said, for instance, if there's the 7 of us and we got enough food for 7, we all eat well. If there's 10 of us, we can stretch it and we'll all be okay. But if there's 20 of us, we're all going to starve. And so unless they can all bring something in. And so I think my view is we need to get better at either helping people contribute. And I think that starts with the people that are here from wherever they came. But also need to understand if we're going to open our doors, it needs to be for good reason, to bring people who have got skill sets or work ethic or willingness to contribute with them, is my view. But give me another reason why Britain's great, because I want to end on a positive note from you, Mary, if we can.
The beautiful countryside.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So we do have a green and pleasant land. So I spend quite a lot of time on railways, actually, going to our museums around the country. And I get such pleasure just watching the fields and the trees and the meadows go by. I know there are more spectacularly beautiful other parts of the world, but for me, this country, England specifically, and its changing seasons are something very special.
I completely agree, and it's all too easy to lose your eyes into a telephone and forget to look out the window. And smell and view the roses, isn't it? But thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. If you've enjoyed today's episode as much as I have, please like, share, subscribe, and let us know your thoughts on any of the things that we've talked about. I value them, and we look forward to seeing you again on another episode of Success as a System. Thank you.